Well, first of all, welcome. We have several new faces. Welcome to everybody. We are still in James chapter 1. We are going to tonight be looking at verses 9 through 12, the power of perspective. But before we move into that section, we're going to go ahead and look back. 2 weeks ago, we challenged everybody to consider a trial that you're currently going through and to ask God to show us how He wants us to respond, to give us wisdom. Whether that's wisdom in a specific decision where you're saying, I need to do this or I need to pick this, or whether it's, Lord, I don't really know how you want me to respond in the middle of this trial. I don't know why this trial is in my life. Help me to sort of see what you see, or at least to be able to trust you in the midst of it. And so we said, hey, as a symbol of that, go ahead, and we provided that check for you to sort of write out a check to God and to sign it, to say, hey, Lord, whatever you want from me, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And so, to follow up, go ahead and form small groups, 2, 3, no more than 4. If you find yourself in a group of 5, you know what to do. You know what to do, people. 2 and 3. And you're going to share 2 things. What was the situation that you prayed about? And number 2, did you receive wisdom from God? And if so, sort of how did things turn out? Take a few minutes, go ahead and break into those small groups and discuss. Go. Now that we've had a chance to reflect on some application from last week, we're going to move forward to introducing James 1, 9 through 12. And if you've been here, you know that we like to start with priming you guys in the text yourselves. So if you would like, you can turn in your workbooks to page 19, or if you have your Bible and you want to use that, go ahead and turn to page, whatever it is in your Bible. Find James 1, 9 through 12. And you're going to skim through it, look over it. If you're like, this is my first week here, I have not read James 1, 9 through 12. Go ahead and read it for the first time. And then in your small groups, you're going to go ahead and share, why do you think James uses the figure of speech in verses 10 through 11? And I sort of gave you a little bit of things to help you get started. So what is the actual image? What's the picture that's being painted? What's the kind of figure? And if you're like, I have no idea, then just skip that one. What's the point of contact? And if you remember, the point of contact is what about the picture is being compared with what? So what is it? You know, the devil is a roaring lion. He's fierce. He's on the hunt. And that's sort of the point that's being compared to the devil from the lion. And then what's the figurative meaning? What does the image actually mean? So why is James using this picture in the section? So you're going to try to spend a few minutes thinking about it, thinking through it, at least getting, again, our minds primed and ready to go in the passage. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to do this. Go ahead, in those same groups, read first, then talk. Go. Yeah. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and start the actual lesson. Hopefully you guys have started really chewing on, especially that figure of speech, thinking about what is it, why is it important, because it is crucial to understanding the passage as a whole. And so as you start thinking about it, get ready to really dive into it, because that, again, that figure is important. So good job. I heard lots of good thoughts as I was going around. But before we look at the figure of speech in verses 10 through 11, before we even get to verse 9, what do we need to look at?
Context.
The context! So let's look at the context, because we must, in fact, look at the context always before we look at the passage. So, back at the very beginning, we said, hey, trials are going to come. It's not an if, but when. Trials of all different kinds. Remember, we said that they're rainbowed trials. They're literally of every color, so it's going to be all shapes, all sizes. Going to be different depending on where God has you, what stage of life you're at. So when they come, what's the goal? The goal is to grow, to become more like Christ, to be better equipped so that we can serve Him. Now, if we're in the trial, you're struggling, you don't know what to do, we can ask God for wisdom to help us endure the trial and become stronger through it. But the condition to get the wisdom from God is to trust Him, to believe that He is the good, faithful, loving, all-powerful God who will in fact give us that wisdom. And so that's the background as we move into these verses. You may look at them and say, what's the heck? This doesn't really seem to be quite connected, especially 9 through 11. And you say, I don't really get it. Why are we now talking about rich and poor? This seems slightly disconnected from the rest of the passage. Now, having gone through and studied it, I can come back around and say, okay, they do fit, they do flow, but why? What about these verses, or what about the book as a whole, may make us think that these verses fit? Well, first of all, James has really been orderly and very logical up until this point, and as we go throughout the book, we'll see that that continues. So James is sort of he's a very good writer, like we said. So it seems odd that he would randomly just start talking about something else. Also, verse 12 very clearly points back to trials. And so, again, it seems odd that he would launch off for just a couple of verses and then come back and be like, okay, now we're back on track. Trials. Sorry, I had a little bit of an episode there. So there's no squirrels here, as far as I'm aware. But there's one more thing that really cinches it for me. We're going to read the verses, take a look, see if you guys can spot it. So, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation. Did you spot it? I hope not, because it's not there on the screen. It's not in English, it's only in Greek. I know, I'm sorry, that was tragic. But there is a but in Greek that is not translated across in most of the English translations. Only in a couple. And so, essentially, you can read the passage in contrast to the doubting man, have this attitude. So there's, in fact, a but that links verses 7 and 8 through to 9 through 11, which makes it very important that we understand, because this is all one flowing thought. Whenever we're in trials, how does this relate? What's going on here? And so basically, this whole idea of enduring trials, James is now going to apply it to two groups of people, rich and poor. And so let's take a look here at this word, brother. Now, you guys remember from the very beginning that we said that the book of James as a whole is written to believers. It seems best to say that it's a group of believers who are in Jerusalem, who've been scattered as a result of persecution. Once again, we see the word brother appearing in verse 9. You may see that I have it in brackets in verse 10. That's because it doesn't appear in either the Greek or English translations, but it's implied that brother appears again. Notice the parallelism here, the implied parallelism. Now, that is an interpretational move to have brother twice. You do have some commentators who say that verse 9, James is talking about believers. Let the lowly believer boast in his exaltation. And then they say that the rich that's talked about is actually an unbeliever.
Say that again.
Exactly. You're like, what the heck? This doesn't even make sense. Can you repeat this? Because this is nonsensical. Basically, they think that James is splitting his audience, that he's, first of all, talking to, okay, let the person who is poor, you poor believing brother, boast in your exaltation. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. And now you secret unbeliever who snuck into the congregation, you're sort of hiding out there because you're hearing the letter too, but you secret unbeliever, you should boast in your humiliation. To me, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense at all. And we're going to see on verse 12 especially, that James is really talking about how the perspective that you're supposed to have when facing trials. And so, once again, I'm going to maintain that the entirety of the passage is talking to believers and is about believers. I want you guys to know that there are some commentators who take a different train of thought, but we're going to address the whole thing as if James is talking to believers. That seems to make the most sense to me, especially with the parallelism and the context here. So we have the word brother and brother, so we're talking about these believers. And we have these two groups, the lowly believer and the rich believer. And again, it's possible to try to make this more of a metaphor or sort of some sort of image where you say, okay, the lowly in spirit, somebody who is humble in spirit, and then the proud. But once again, if you're sort of quoting Pastor Jeff here, if the plain sense makes sense, say, seek no other sense. So it seems to be that James is really just talking about lowly in circumstance, and then rich is just rich. We got some money, we got some wealth here. So we have these two groups of people. It's very possible that those who were not rich, the lowly believers, had come into poverty as a result of the persecution, that they'd had some wealth and lost it. It's not necessarily so, but it's possible. And for the rich believers, it's also possible that, remember, he's writing to the scattered believers, that they had basically had the trial hit them, but they've been able to survive and come out the other side, or at least were sort of in the middle of it, doing fairly well. Their financial status hadn't really changed. They still had their holdings out in all these places. Maybe their business was still going strong, and they're doing all right. They're still like hanging on. So we've got the rich believers over here. We've got the poor believers over here. And James is addressing them both. And he's saying, okay, you guys, you're both going to do something. You're going to boast. Now, if I say the word boast, immediately in all of your minds comes a very negative connotation of somebody swaggering into the room and talking about their new kitchen appliance or their remodeled kitchen, or they're saying, oh, well, you know what, my kids, well, have you heard about my kids or my husband, or, whatever. It's a very, sort of thing where you're puffing yourself up and this is arrogance, and it's not a pretty word in our context today. We don't usually use the word boast in a positive light. However, in the context here, James is using it in a positive way, because the word boast is not limited to how we use it today. In the original context, it really means to glory or to rejoice in something. So you can think about it perhaps in the context of a newborn baby. So they are rejoicing in the birth of a new grandchild. And that's a very positive sense. But we would never say she's boasting in the birth of her grandchild unless we wanted to make some sort of really weird comments about them. They're really being weird about the birth of their grandchild. So if you just sort of take out the word boast and put rejoice in the text, then that helps us to get a better sense of it in how we use the word today. So let the lowly brother, or let the lowly believer, rejoice in his exaltation, and the rich brother rejoice in his humiliation. Now, what does that mean? Those are sort of weird phrases. What do they mean? In order to understand it, like I said, we have to understand the figure of speech. So let's take another look at that. We're going to go ahead, read through, and then we'll talk about it. Because, like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. And notice that this is really giving us a description of the rich person, not the poor person, because the poor person image is, the phrase is a little bit easier to understand, but the rich one is really what we're sort of, is the phrase that sort of is hard to understand. So let's dig into this a little bit more. Remember, whenever we have a figure of speech, we want to identify those four things. So, first of all, we have the image itself. Pretty straightforward. We have a flower that's paired with a scorching sun. The main point of the image is the flower itself. It's not the sun. The sun is part of the image that helps to convey what's going on, but our focus is on the flower. It comes up, it's beautiful, and then it's gone. Passes away, it withers and dries up. So that's the image. The type is a simile. And so remember, a simile is a comparison that uses like or as. If you were like, well, I didn't go back to my high school English class, sorry, I didn't pull it up, that's fine. And now you know, that's there. And we do have both like in the passage and then so also, and that functions basically the same way as like or as. So we have this two-part simile here. Because there are two comparisons, we have the rich like a flower passes away, and as the grass withers and its flower falls, so also a rich man fades away in the midst of his pursuits. That's sort of the two-part point of contact. What's being compared with what is you have these sort of it's fading away, the rich person's fading away, as the grass withers and falls, a rich man fades away in the midst of his pursuits. And so to clarify this point of contact and to draw a little bit more of a picture to understand the meaning even better, we're going to take a little bit of a field trip. We're going to go around the world, and we're going to go to the Middle East. No, not actually, but I am going to take you there on the screen. So, in the Middle East, in Israel, some of you may have been there. Some of you have been there. It is hot. It is so hot. It's a desert. It is such a hot desert. Now, all of these pictures were taken in Israel of real flowers. And I had lots more. I wondered how in the world I could be finding all of these flowers because, like I said, it was hot. And it wasn't like Pennsylvania heat where you go outside and it's sort of like that wet, humid heat where you feel like there's this wet blanket that's sort of stifling your face. No. It was a dry heat. It was the baking incinerator heat where you almost didn't sweat because as soon as any water appeared, it just sort of, and then you're like, so it was hot, and I was surprised to see life, but there was. And whenever I was preparing for the lesson, guys, I tried so hard. I did so much research because I thought for sure, one of the flowers that I'd taken a picture of would be one of those famous flowers that would wither away in the heat. Apparently not. Apparently they're all very hardy plants that have, like, over time been geared specifically toward living in Israel in the heat. So they're all like, we're doing fine. And I was like, this is not helpful for my image. So let's go to Arizona. So in Arizona, I promise there are flowers in Israel that do fade away quickly. I just don't have pictures of them from my trip. So not in Israel, in Arizona, we went on this hike around the Grand Canyon, and we are hiking up, and it is again a very hot day. And there were all of these wild primroses along the path. It was really cool, really pretty, and we're like, oh, it's so much fun. Distracts us from the stifling heat. It was a hot trip. So we get to the top, we enjoy a quick little lunch, and then we turn around and we start coming down. And to my utter shock, the wild primroses, which had not an hour before so graciously bestowed their presence upon us, were gone. They had literally withered and dried up and were like flopped on the side of the path. And I was like, I'm glad I got those pictures on the way up. Oh my gosh. And I've never seen it happen that fast, that within the space of an hour, it was gone. The heat had just taken them right out. And that's the image that we're looking at here. It's in the space of just even seconds. The flower's amazing beauty passes away. It's not there anymore. And so the point of contact in this image is its transience. The fact that the flower was once there and the next second it's gone. It fades away in the space of a moment. It doesn't last. It's not dependable. It's not a thing of eternal value. And so the meaning then of the image is to establish perspective. As Pastor Chip Ingram says, this section is all about establishing that eternal perspective. These believers are all going to be facing persecution, or they're currently experiencing persecution. And regardless of whether or not they're currently experiencing persecution or whether it's coming their way, trials, like we said, are inevitable. And so when those trials hit, each group needs to have the same perspective, but the perspective will play out in different ways. And so going back to verse 9, let's sort of look at it again. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich brother boast in his humiliation. For the poor, what they need to have in mind is that they will one day be exalted. Think about it. They've been living for Christ. They made this decision to follow him. And all of a sudden, they've been cast from their homes. They're scattered. Remember that the first week when we went down that whole list of all the different things they're facing. And they may be wondering, is this really worth it? Or perhaps, am I somehow less than? Am I a less than believer because I'm somehow in these terrible straits? Does God love me less than he loves those people? And James is saying, nope. Stop it right there. Let me just sort of get you this eternal perspective here. You are exalted in Christ. because of your position in Christ, because you are secure in Christ. And hey, going through these trials, you're going to be more mature, you're going to be able to grow, you're going to be able to become more like Christ, and you're going to be able to praise the Savior, and he's going to praise you after you have stood firm. And so having the perspective beyond their immediate circumstances will give them the strength and the courage that they need to face those trials head on. Now, that sort of makes sense, right? So we say, okay, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. And that sort of phrasing, now, that makes a relative amount of sense, right? Well, what about that second phrase? The rich in his humiliation. Well, think about it. The rich are already in an exalted status, at least from a worldly perspective, right? Before push comes to shove, the rich may be tempted to put their trust in wealth. They may feel like they can weather whatever storm comes their way because of all they've saved up and all their business goings on. They can see their wealth like the flowers of the field. Maybe it's a prospering business, abundant crops, excellent business connections. And so, is it worth it to follow Christ, especially with all of this at risk? And so, James tells the rich to keep their eyes on their humiliation. And so let's take a look again at that figure of speech here. So like a flower of the grass, he, the rich man, will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Remember, if the point of contact for the flower is its transience, the fact that it won't last, the fact that it'll fade away, what it's connecting to has to be connected to the rich man. Then it'll fade away, fall, perish. And so there's sort of two slices of the same thought that you can take whenever you're looking at this. You can either think about this specifically looking at the rich man's wealth, that his wealth, well, will pass away, that it's not reliable, that, hey, your business may be going well one day, but tomorrow, who knows what will happen tomorrow? How many stories have we heard of people who had these flourishing economies and then all of a sudden something happens and it's down the tanks and they have nothing. Not only so, but wealth doesn't last forever. Remember, you want your glory. Does your wealth come with you?
Nope.
Nope, it does not. And the rich man himself, will he last? No, he won't. His wealth cannot save him. Though he may think that his wealth is a security, is something that he can rely on, he's going to face the same fate as the poor believer. And even though it may look like it's something that will provide a buffer, in the end, is there anything that he can really do? No. I think that really we're thinking about this in context of eternity, because in the next verse we're going to be looking at what will last. And so what's going, as in contrast to what the rich man has built up, in contrast to all of these things that he's currently relying on, we're going to be looking at, hey, there's this crown of life that's coming, and what is this thing? We're going to take a look at it in just a second. I want to pause for a moment, though, and think about really getting into the rich man's head, because death is something that is a little bit terrifying whenever it comes up close, but it's something that most of us don't think about. We sort of push it off to the side, push it out of sight, and that's why so many people these days are not just worried about COVID, but they're terrified, because it's been brought to their minds for the first time that death is a real thing, and they feel like they can't do anything to stop it. And so they're desperately trying to do everything within their power to keep death at bay. But nothing ultimately can keep death at bay. So there's no human endeavor, whether it's wealth or something else, that can keep death from knocking at your door, right? But so, basically, what James is trying to encourage the rich man to do is to be thinking about, again, the eternal perspective. In contrast to relying on your wealth, which is going to pass away like that, think about your humiliation. And what is that? Well, whenever he dies, what's going to happen to his wealth? It's gone. He's going to be leveled off, just like whenever everybody else. When we get to heaven, there's not going to be rich and poor. There's not going to be any of those differences. We're just all going to be standing before the throne of God, and what he's looking at isn't how much we've amassed in this life. He's looking at how well we've served him. And so James is telling these rich believers, hey, get your perspective straight. Don't let your confidence be in the things of this world, because they're going to fail you. And they're not going to be what's important in the end. And so, with all that in mind, let's take a look at verse 12. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Now, the very first word that we want to take a look at here is the word blessed or blessed. And this verse really caps off the entire section. It brings that eternal perspective into clear focus. And it's going to give us the ultimate motivator for enduring the trial and trusting God through it all. And the first part of that is this blessedness or this happiness. And think back to, in verse 2, we talked about joy. Count it pure joy. And by using blessed and joy at the beginning and end here, James is forming something called an inclusio. Inclusio. I had trouble spelling it this morning. I don't know why, but I could not spell it for the life. And basically, it's whenever an idea or word is repeated at the beginning and the end of a section that sort of helps to cap it off. Again, this is something that's used in Greek and Hebrew that's not used as much in our English writings today, but it was very common back then. And so he's basically sectioning this whole thing off and saying, hey, this is all one big section, but we didn't address it all as one big section, because if we had, we would have been here for a very long time and my voice would have given out a long time ago. But the point here is that, okay, happy, joyful is the person who, what? I want to also, oh look, I had a slide. Haha, look! Verse 2, count it all joy. There it is, cool. The word for man here is a generic term like it's been in other places. So this is not just saying, blessed is the masculine person who, this is just a general term. You can read it as believer. That makes sense of the passage. Blessed is the believer who remains steadfast under trial. If you're a Christian and you're facing a trial, congratulations, you qualify. So, I want to point out several words here that are going back to verses 2 and 3. We're going to go through several of them. We're going to see, again, James is really tying this all together. He's helping to make one cohesive point out of the entire passage here. The first phrase or word that we see here is hypomene. And who remembers the word hypomene? What does it mean? Does anybody remember, or the picture that we had? I'll give you a hint. Mina! What about Mina?
Staying.
Yes, very good. It's the staying power. It's endurance. It's the steadfastness. So remember we said, hey, whenever we tell Mina, our puppy, to stay, she really, really, really wants to get up, but she's holding fast. She's enduring under that intense pressure that's building up within her. She just wants to say hi, but she's staying for the moment. How long will it last? So that's the hypomene, remains steadfast, and that popped up in both verses 2 and 3 and verse 12. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast. That's the same word. The next word we have is periosmos. Now this is one of two words that refers to a similar idea. Does anybody remember what the word periosmos refers back to? Or you want to take a wild guess? Lisa wants to take a wild guess. No, Lisa doesn't want to take a wild guess. So this word If you remember Ninja Blender, that may ring a bell. This is trial. As we said a couple of weeks ago, it's also used perhaps of a fledgling bird testing its wings. We said, hey, if Sue, the secretary, gives us a blender and she says, hey, this is a genuine Ninja Blender, but the label's rubbed off, we said, what are we going to do? We're going to test it and see if it lives up to its so-called label. And of course, it's genuine, because would Sue, the secretary, give us a Ninja Blender, tell us it's a Ninja Blender, and for it not to be a Ninja Blender?
No.
Of course not. Would never malign Sue. No, of course, it's a genuine article. And so we said, hey, it's not that going through the trial, if you stumble, that you're somehow not a Christian, but it's that the process by which you become stronger enables you to endure and to become more like Christ. So it's that whole, it's the process of the trial. And so, next word here is dokimos. And we said, hey, in English, the words are very similar, but in Greek, they're very different. This is basically the word for testing. And so, remember, we said that this word was used of metals that we use to test to prove whether or not they're genuine. And so, basically, whenever putting the whole thing together, this whole thing, the person who is blessed is the believer who, in the middle of the trial, is standing firm. Notice it's not after the trial's over. It's not, hey, a couple years down the road when you look back. It's here, it's now. Blessed is the man who remains, present tense, steadfast. I took out this verb is because that's not in the Greek either. There's no linking verb there. It's just blessed person. If you remember back to Ruth, whenever we were talking about how Ruth, whenever she's giving her speech about Naomi, says, hey, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. We said, hey, in the original language, there aren't any verbs there. It's just your people, my people. Your God, my God. It's sort of a similar idea here, where there's no verbs, so that the ideas can be even more closely related here. And so, blessed person. Blessed right here, right now. You can have joy. You can be happy right here, right now, in the middle of the trial as you stand. Why? Why? We have this lovely for when that enables us to sort of connect these ideas here. James is going to give us some courage because we have something that is coming. There are two words that he uses in close conjunction. The first word is crown. The Greek word is stephanos. You have probably heard Pastor Jeff or Pastor Jace use it on Sundays. This is the victor's crown that they would have used for a race or for military victories. And he pairs it, interestingly, with the word Zoe, which is translated life, which complicates the meaning a little bit. I will let you know the commentators are divided as to the meaning of this phrase. There are two basic trains of thought here. The first way that you can understand it is that this crown of life is basically eternal life. That whenever you have successfully completed all of the trials, you have stood fast, you've gotten through to the end, you've then reached the glory, and you're before the throne of God. He says, well done, good and faithful servant, and you enter into that eternal state. And so that's one possible interpretation. This is going to be transitioning to the future. There's no poor Christians, there's no rich Christians. It's just, we are all in this crowned state together. Other people say that the crown is something that we experience here in this life, that it's a present experience. So they say that this is more like an abundant life, that this is life to the full. That you're basically experiencing the fullness of life here and now. Those are both possible interpretations. I tend to go for the first one. Notice that we have a change of tense here. From blessed, remember, no is, just blessed man who remains, present tense, steadfast. For when he has stood, he will receive. So that seems to change. Again, we have a little bit of a change of tense here. So it's not that right here, right now, we're living an abundant life, but it's something in the future that is coming. I think that it makes sense, especially whenever you're thinking about the perspective that we've been talking about this whole time, that James is establishing that it's an eternal perspective that we're looking at. In contrast to thinking about, well, I'm really poor, and I don't know, maybe God loves me, maybe he doesn't. Maybe I shouldn't follow him because, I don't know, this is hard. Or on the other hand, hey, I've got wealth, this'll last me the whole way. No. Get rid of all of that. Think about the eternal perspective. That one day we're going to get to the end of the race. What'll matter? Did we endure? Did we stand the test? That's what God's looking for. And so I think that's the intent of what James is looking at here. And this is fun. We're going to get a little bit nerdy for a second. Which God has promised to those who love him. Now, in Greek, in the original language, there are several manuscript variants. There's some textual variants here about the word God. Some manuscripts say that which the word theos, or theos, God, which is just the generic term for God. They have that word there. Some have the word Kyrios, which is the word for Lord. So they'll say, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And some manuscripts phrase it essentially, which has been promised to those who love him. Now you're looking at me going, Mariah, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, it doesn't really matter. And that's the point. The point is that all those textual variants don't even matter, guys. All these critics of the Bible get up on their high horse and they say, oh, well, the Bible has so many variants. Now, I will tell you that the most likely original manuscript is probably which has been promised, just because there is God and then there is Lord, and those are the different variants that have been found. And so it's likely, not a guarantee, but likely that there was nothing there, and so different scribes, while they were copying, said, oh, I bet that somebody forgot the word God, I'll just add it back in. Or they wanted to add it for clarification. And so there's developed two different lines, because some said, oh, the Lord fits here, and some said, oh, God fits here, and they just picked different ones. But the essence of the phrase remains exactly the same, even though there are three different textual variants for what's in this passage, right? And so take heart whenever you're thinking about textual variants, and people are saying, oh, well, did you know that the Bible has all of these variations, all these mistakes that have been copied down? No. Just don't even worry about it. If you come across somebody who says it, ask them to name an example, and then the conversation will go down the tube, right? So the essentials here is that God is the one who has promised it. Of course, God is the executor of this promise. And to whom? And to those who love him. And what's cool is that the word for love here is agape, or agape, or however you pronounce it. Do I know? No. Do I speak Greek? No, come on, you guys know. I don't speak Greek, so how do you pronounce that word? I don't know. Pick your favorite. But again, this isn't the feelings-based love. This is the action-based love. This is the unconditional love. It's to those who love God, those who follow him. And so, we see the firm promise of God to his followers. They do not strive in futility, in blind hope. Instead, we endure purposefully with the goal of everlasting life with God in sight. And he doesn't promise this crown to some elite few who, have somehow managed to achieve the glories. No, he promises it to all who love him, to all his followers. Even if you do stumble, even if you are struggling, he promises it to all. The point isn't to say, all right, you better shape up, otherwise you're not going to get that crown. It's an encouragement to say, I know you're struggling. I know it's hard. Take heart. There is hope. So that's the point. So let's go ahead and look at the big picture, because anytime we come to the end, we don't want to walk away and have the sort of thing that's stuck in our heads be, wow, you know what? Mariah showed us some pictures of flowers in Israel. Wasn't that nice? And you're like, no, that's not the point. So let's get the big picture in mind. This is all about perspective. We're not zeroing in on either the richness in our life or the poverty in our life. We're thinking about the eternal perspective here. Our hope is ultimately in God. It shouldn't be in the things of this world. And for us, we may have to take it beyond just material wealth and money and broaden it to other things. Maybe broaden it to relationships, a really good church, You can fill it in with all sorts of things. We don't want to be relying on things of the world. We want to be relying on God. That's what gives us hope, courage, and gladness in the here and now. And so the obvious then application is for us to ask ourselves, what's my hope in? One of my questions that I like to ask is, what do I bolt to? Whenever something's going wrong, what is my first reflex? Do I go for that cup of coffee? I'm not talking about myself. Or that bag of sweet potato chips? Still definitely not talking about myself. You know, whenever trouble hits you, whenever you're struggling, whenever you're discouraged, whenever you're frustrated, what goes on in your heart? What shows up in your life? What do you rely on? And as we close out this mini section, we're also closing out this whole sort of bigger section as a whole. As I mentioned, again, if we had taken the time to go through the whole thing, I would be voiceless and you would all be asleep and it would just not be the most effective thing. So we broke it up into like 17 sections. But the big picture of the entire passage, trials will come, not if but when. But we can consider them, we can count them. Remember, we say we make a decision to think about them as a blessing because they help us to become like Christ. They help us mature and they help us to endure. If we have trouble, if we struggle in the middle of the trial, God will give us wisdom if we trust Him, if we rely on Him. And the ultimate fear and doubt crusher is that eternal perspective. When we have that eternal perspective, when we have eternity in mind, when we really grasp it, whenever it's not just, oh yes, heaven's coming, isn't that nice? But whenever it's real to us, how will our lives change? So, I'm going to take a look at our challenge question, and then we're going to break into some small groups after we look at homework 2. Our challenge is going to be, and this is, I'm going to have to explain this, on an index card, or if you want to write in your book, you can do that too. Write down the underlying lie behind something you're tempted to bolt to instead of God. Now you're like, Mariah, I don't understand. What are you talking about? So, I may or may not have mentioned sweet potato chips. They're delicious. Oh my gosh, they're so good. So, perhaps, maybe, if I'm feeling sad or if I'm feeling frustrated, I may possibly be tempted to go to the cupboard, pull out the bag of sweet potato chips, and stand there and eat, I don't know, 50 or so sweet potato chips. And then I feel a little bit better. And I'm like, okay, cool. And then I put them away and then I walk away. Now that is, in a moment, am I really actively thinking about the sweet potato chips and what they will do for me? No, it's just sort of like, that's what I'm going to in the middle. So what I want to do is I want to stop, take a step back, and identify the lie that I'm believing about the sweet potato chips. I have the ability to choose the best illustration, Joe. So, what I'm believing is the sweet potato chips will somehow make my situation better. Is that if I feel a little bit better, if I have some satisfaction in the moment, that somehow my life will be more endurable, that I will be able to go on better than before. When in fact, I have probably just gained a couple of pounds and have gotten distracted from something else that the Lord wanted me to do and stopped listening to Him for a whole 3 minutes while I was chowing down legitimately a quarter bag of sweet potato chips. So hopefully your situation is not completely lined up with mine, but that's the idea. You don't want to just identify, oh yeah, I eat sweet potato chips when I'm mad, but why? Why do you eat sweet potato chips when you're mad? Why do you go to them when you're feeling frustrated? What are you thinking? What subtle lie are you believing? You want to try to identify that too, because then you will be able to effectively create stop yourself in the middle of the behavior. And then on the back of the card, write James 1:12. Don't just write the reference, write the verse, write the whole verse. But so that whenever difficult trials come, whether it's something that makes you upset or sad, or maybe just frustrated, you can think about, okay, what am I tempted to go to? I'm going to stop, and instead I'm going to reorient my perspective and get that eternal perspective in mind. So that's the goal, that's the challenge. As always, if you feel the Lord laying something different on your heart in regards to application, do that. Please do that. Listen to the Spirit. Don't listen to me. I'm just kidding. So homework is going to be lesson number 5. James, still chapter 1. We are not at the end. This section is also not the end. James 1, 13 through 18, temptation, trouble. This is going to be pages 22 through 26. So, now what we're going to do is we're going to close out our time together on video. You may turn the camera off. Goodbye.